folks. Welcome back to another episode of the Podcast Digest. Thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Dan Lizette, and this is episode 62. I hope you folks have been enjoying a lot of the recent interviews that I've had. I know I've really enjoyed having them, and it's been a pleasure to talk to some of the folks I've had the opportunity to speak to recently, and there is no difference with this episode as well. This is a little bit different of a show recommendation. I talk a lot about sort of my two favorite genres. You guys already know, longtime listeners of the Podcast Digest, big tech fan, big storytelling podcast fan, but I do want to try to represent as many different genres and as different interests that I think a well-rounded podcast listener would be most interested in. And with my show recommendation and guests for this episode, I think I'm checking that box. The show I want to tell you guys about today is a show called The Pollsters, and the hosts are Kristen Soltis Anderson and Margie Omero, and I'm humbled to be joined by both of these ladies tonight. Kristen and Margie, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Thanks so much for having us.
Well, thank you guys very much for joining me. And The Pollsters is something that's completely different than what I've recommended in the past, but I am absolutely hooked. I came about it somewhere around episode 20, I think, as of the time of this recording, which is the eve of the first Democratic debate, folks. So this is Monday, October 12th, just for folks listening in terms of if we make any wonderful claims about the status of things, you guys will understand. But I've been hooked ever since, and it is one of my must-listens now. But before we talk about the show itself, I wanted listeners to learn a little bit about the two hosts. So let's start with Margie. Can you tell folks a little bit about yourself, your background, and how they all led to the Pollsters?
Sure. Well, I'm a Democratic pollster, and I've been working in Democratic politics for a long time, for about 20 years. First, I started with a Democratic pollster named Mark Mellman, who was John Kerry's pollster in the last when he ran for president. And I started my own firm, though, before that in around 2001, and had my own firm, Momentum Analysis, for about a dozen years. And then a couple years ago, I joined Purple Strategies, which is a bipartisan firm where we don't work for candidates. We do communications for brands and nonprofits and large corporations. But I'm still a Democrat. I mean, purple means blue and red coming together, blue traditionally being the color of Democrats and red traditionally being the color of Republicans. You can see in our show art, our cover art for the Pollsters, but I still remain active in Democratic politics. And I've seen Kristen and I have bumped into each other for years, doing TV or speaking. There aren't that many youngish, I don't really consider myself very young anymore, but Kristen's still young, but young on the younger side of things, women pollsters. So we've bumped into each other a lot. And I had an idea. I listen to podcasts a lot, and I had an idea about doing a podcast. I spent a little bit of time looking it up to see if there was any other polling podcasts and if there was any other podcast, bipartisan, two women, Democrat and Republican women as co-hosts. And there were neither of those things, let alone all those things at the same time. And so Kristen and I met for coffee, and it was just like, it seemed like an immediate good idea that we would do it. And really there was nobody else other than Kristen that I would have wanted to do this with. I mean, she's just the, perfect person for this. And, we have a lot of fun, not just talking about polling, but also talking about polling in a, really bipartisan way, not in like a screamy partisan bickering kind of way, but in a, we have differences of opinion, but let's look at the data, and sometimes one side is doing a little bit better at things, and sometimes the other side is doing a little bit better at things. And being able to look at that through a bipartisan, collaborative, data-driven lens is something that is important to both of us.
And Kristen?
Yeah, when Margie and I first, we've both been in the polling world together for the last couple of years, and we both found ourselves doing NPR's coverage of the State of the Union together, and we just it really worked. And as we were walking out that late night after having talked about the State of the Union on air, Margie was like, "Hey, let's get coffee sometime. I've got an idea I want to run by you." And I feel like it's what we really try to do is, even though she and I both have different political views, we think that actually creates a better discussion without creating partisan debate, because we can both look at the same poll and have sort of different takes on what findings are interesting to us, rather than getting into a dispute over what the results mean. And I think that creates a much more pleasant listening experience for our audience than, just another show where two people from different sides of the aisle argue with each other. I think that's a real strength of what we've been able to do with the pollsters.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, it's not something that people really think typically about pollsters that work with campaigns or work with candidates. They think of pollsters being so partisan and that they just tell a candidate what they want to hear. And that's not really in your interest. I mean, I've worked with candidates, Kristen's worked with candidates, and when you advise them, this is not the public stuff that we talk about on the pollsters, but when you advise them on what their messaging should be, which is what a lot of partisan private polling is about, it's not in your interest to give them wrong information because you agree with it. It's not in your interest to say, or in your client's interest to say, you're winning, you're up, and everybody wants to talk about, everyone wants to hear you talk about such and such issue, if that's not what people want to hear. So your job is really to have a more thoughtful, rational, again, use the word data-driven, being able to look at the facts for what they are, being able to hear voters and what they're trying to tell you, rather than trying to give a candidate your own or your candidate's own partisan bias back to them.
Before we get into the show itself, I'm a little curious. I think I know, and I think I'm pretty close, but I imagine there's going to be some people listening, like maybe my mother. What exactly is a pollster? And more importantly, how does one sort of end up in that line of work? I imagine, is this school for communication, journalism, public relations, all of it? Or sort of how does that path get created for someone?
I came to polling in part because I was very interested in communication, but had an aptitude for dealing with data, and I liked research. I think that the biggest prerequisite for being in the polling field is to be very, very curious, because you spend your entire career posing questions and seeking answers to those questions. I got into the field in part because I wanted to be a speechwriter or work in some kind of political communications career. And I had a friend that sort of suggested, hey, why don't you try out a career in polling? And so I started off at a polling firm as the phone answerer and spreadsheet updater. And, after a decade, went out on my own and started my own firm. And here I am doing the podcast with Margie. But I think for me, the way one gets into polling, you can study political science, you can study statistics. You can really, I think, study pretty much whatever. I would encourage people to have some kind of basic statistical background. But a lot of polling, is also something that you learn in practice, that you learn the ability to write a survey that's not just going to be methodologically correct, but also, ask questions that are really interesting and know when you get those results back exactly what are the numbers you should go hunting for to see what your survey is telling you. That's something that's very hard to teach, and that I think, just working in the field is something you learn over time.
And for me, I came to it from a slightly different way, but I think some similarities to Kristen's story. And my mom worked for a market research firm, and when I was a kid, I would go to the office with her. And this was, years ago, where there was a card room, because they would punch the results on cards, which of course they don't do anymore. So that's how long ago this was. But I was just, mesmerized by what she did at the office. And I thought, this is really great. I want to do this when I grow up. I would look through her crosstabs, which were the big books of where you would have every question run by every demographic subgroup. And she would ask me to look through them when I was around 6 years old. And I said, did you tell your clients that your 6-year-old daughter did their work for them? she said no. They don't want to know that a 6-year-old did their work for them. I'm like, oh, okay, got it. All right. I think I understand why they wouldn't want that. But so it just seemed like something that came naturally to me. And when I was in college, I went to the University of Texas, and I used longitudinal research data for my honors thesis, and that included not just looking up quantitative data, but and doing analysis on the quantitative data. I also worked on projects where I would do the interviews, which were more qualitative in nature, and so that helped focus not just on the statistics, but also on the interviewing and the listening and the qualitative piece, and also the methods, designing a study and making sure every time you ask a question, you ask it the same way, those kinds of things. And then I moved to Washington because I too, like Kristen, thought, well, maybe I want to do journalism or communications. There are all these other things I'm interested in. Everything seemed to converge in Washington. And my first internship, I guess my second internship, was at Roll Call newspaper, which at the time there was the wave of freshmen after 1994. The new wave of Republican freshmen had just come in, and we were working on a story about turnover in the freshman offices. That what was the average number of employees that they ran through at these different freshman offices. And I said, well, it's different if you look at the mean versus the median, because there are a couple members who fired a lot of people, and that's throwing the average off, but really the median is different. And all the reporters looked at me like, what are you talking about? We don't understand. And I thought, maybe I'm not in the right job. Maybe I need to be in a job where there's a little bit more, that has a little bit more math to it. And so somebody hooked me up with the Melman Group, and I started there. And it was really just a great place to work, where you had to run data and fill in tables and check numbers and fax things and all that kind of entry level stuff. I did statistics in college as well, but not everybody in polling is a statistician. I mean, there are lots of different ways to work in polling and research, and some of it is qualitative interviewing, being able to think on your feet. Being simply comfortable with math is it works for some positions. I mean, it really depends on the kind of job you're looking for, but also being able to write. I mean, a lot of people think that polling is for math folks, and people who like to write go into something else. But being able to write clearly in the language that regular folks use and understand is crucial, especially since the results of which we should mention, get translated into television ads or direct mail pieces or online ads or speeches. So it really needs to be accessible, and it needs to be something a candidate or an organization would say, and that people, if they heard it, would understand.
I'll tell you what, I think I'm honestly a closet pollster. This stuff is so intriguing to me. I'm writing down all these questions. I have a feeling I could really blow past my time here. There's a couple of different things that I really kind of latched onto there. And I think, Kristen, you originally mentioned this about the idea of making sure that the questions that are being written and delivered to the recipients are engaging. And it called to mind, during my day job, I'm in a corporate environment, and I'm responsible for a lot of staff, and there's an annual survey that is sent out, and everyone is asked to do it. It's a volunteer thing. But so often it seems like the questions may be disjointed or written very oddly, where typically a positive response would be all yeses, and then one sort of hops over and actually a positive response is a no. And then people just end up being disengaged because they don't feel applicability to the work site. How important is it in the polling process that the questions are engaging, so that the results have come from people who have partaken in the process, that they did it with interest and vigor and enthusiasm, as opposed to just check.
This is a really hard piece of doing any kind of polling on political subjects, because you can imagine that a survey about, entertainment or, certain consumer products, that's going to be a little easier to keep people engaged than, say, a survey about U.S. trade policy toward Asia. Not that people are not smart, not that people are not interested in these things, but it's just really dense stuff. And it can be hard, to get someone really focused on answering questions for 2 minutes, much less 10 minutes or 20 minutes like some of these surveys are. So the onus is really on the pollster to figure out, how do I ask questions that are going to be meaningful, that will get at things that people can answer, where even if they haven't read extensively about the issue, they can sort of give me a sense of what their gut instinct is telling them, what their, snap judgment is telling them, that can help me as a pollster understand how the debate might play out. On one of the episodes of the show, Margie and I talked a lot about polling on the issue of Iran and the Iran deal between the U.S. Around sort of nuclear policy. And, you can turn on the news and see information about what's going on with the U.S. and Iran. But for the most part, even your average informed citizen is not going to deeply understand the policy and the details of the negotiations between the U.S. and Iran. So we talked about a survey that was done where a bipartisan team of experts created a briefing on Iran and presented that briefing to survey respondents and had them read through it before asking them questions. And, it presents really different information than when you just ask people a yes or no question. Do you support or oppose the U.S. deal with Iran? People will give you an answer to that question. And in one sense, that's meaningful information because that's what people are going to be thinking about when they go to vote, even if they're not deeply aware of what's in the deal. On the other hand, if you really want to understand how people would think about the policy, were they more informed, this methodology that gives them a bunch of information is also valuable, but in a very different way. So, as a pollster, you've really got to think, okay, on the one hand, I want to make sure that I'm getting useful information out of my respondents. But on the other hand, useful information might very well be knowing what people's gut reaction is to a policy that they don't know that much about, because that's the environment that we're going to have when people walk into a voting booth. Right. So, there are kind of two different ways of looking at it.
I would add two other things that I think are interesting to think about on this topic. First is when you do online surveys, which not many political candidates are doing quite yet, but lots of companies are doing. There are techniques you can use to make simply the act of completing the survey a little bit more fun for respondents. And we haven't even talked about this on the show, but it's an interesting topic where, using a slider or showing images can just keep people a little bit more engaged than just clicking 1, 2, 3, or 4 or something like that. So there are techniques there. The other thing is when you work with a client, it's incumbent upon the pollster to tell the client, that we're now going to be reaching respondents' max capacity. This is going to be too long. This question is too long. They're not going to understand this. Something I say a lot is we may be able to write a question about that and we may come to an agreement about what that question should look like. That doesn't mean that respondents are going to understand what we're asking them. And it doesn't mean that we're going to get good information. So, just because we can ask it, we can operationally get it asked and get a response for it, doesn't mean that that response is something that we can then use and interpret in a way that's ultimately reflects where the public is.
Super interesting stuff. One more question on the science and the business side, and then we're going to talk about the show, I promise. But I imagine most people listening, if they're not familiar with polling or pollsters in general, are definitely familiar in this sense. Election night, you're watching the returns, and you hear exit polling indicates. For folks who aren't familiar at all with what that is, can you tell them a little bit, how is that done? I've always gotten the impression, are there literally people waiting outside of elementary schools, interviewing people and taking notes and feeding that back up? Or how does exit polling work?
There are, in fact, people waiting outside elementary schools.
Wow.
Yes,
I was right.
Exactly
I thought it was.
Yes, that's exactly it. I mean, it's tricky, right? Obviously, it takes a huge amount of manpower to do that, and woman power to do that. And it's not simply just, we asked a bunch of people and here's what we found. It's also making sure you're asking the right people and that you're asking a representative portion of people, that when you tabulate the data, you're looking at the right counties and then you're making the right projections based on how those counties came in. So if you have a really Democratic county come in first in a state, in a battleground state, you shouldn't automatically call that state for somebody because you haven't had all the rural areas come in yet. So that's another layer on top of it. So, so there's a lot, it's a huge process, and it's not a surprise that it gets complicated and confusing, and that you have a lot of networks now trying to wait longer just to be, just to put off making a call just as long as they can. So nobody jumps the gun a little too quickly.
An analogy that I've used to describe exit polls is that they're a little bit like bacon. Raw, you do not want to consume them. But once they've been prepared properly, they are delicious and wonderful. And part of that is because of exactly what Margie just talked about, that early on election night, the data comes in and it's incomplete. They don't yet know how to adjust it demographically. There's a lot that goes into kind of refining exit polls. And actually, the night of the election, exit polls are kind of dicey. They can be way off the mark. What exit polls are really valuable for is after the election is over, you can go back and you can say, okay, we interviewed 50 people in precinct A. and they broke 60-40 for Barack Obama over Mitt Romney. But we know that that precinct actually split 50-50. So we know that our sample was a little bit skewed compared to the real results. So we can weight our sample accordingly to match those real results. And you do that across tens of thousands of interviews across the country, and you get a data set that's really great to evaluate and can tell you after the election a little bit about why the person who won and why the person who lost. But on election night, I always tell people to kind of buyer beware. When you start seeing those headlines pop up, early exit polls indicate so-and-so is ahead. Right. Please, whatever you do, do not buy into those headlines.
Right. And it's, and it's not unlike now where people desperately want people want numbers. They want some way to quantify what's happening. And you see the, increased interest in polling now when we're so far out from any election at all, but people want to see, who's up 10 or who's up, 3 points, 4 points, really making a huge decision or huge headlines and huge judgments over which candidates stay in the race or where they're buying television time or who gets in the debate stage, who gets interviews. I mean, you're seeing really big decisions being made on very early polling numbers. And again, it's part of the same thing you see on election night, this desire to have some kind of way to quantify it, which you could argue is an improvement over, reporters or the press or other folks just simply making assumptions based on, with the absence of data. But there are times where the data can point people in the wrong direction.
So way back when, 33 episodes ago, Margie had an idea and you approach Kristen and you guys sit down and talk about it. Take us from there to the launch of the first episode. How did you guys put this together? What was sort of the goals of the show?
The goal was and still is, right? One is, it's fun, right? It's fun to talk about polls and have a venue where you can really go through in depth, not just the horse race, but everything else. And really, truly everything else. I mean, there's so much actual research out there. There's enough easily to make 2 or 3 shows a week in terms of all the data that get released every week, all the methodological stories in the news, all the kind of fun stuff that we like to talk about. There's so much of that out there that's, easily consumable that we could digest and talk about even more often. So it's fun to really be able to dig deep in a way that you simply don't get in a 5-minute hit or a short blog post or even the shows that dig deep a little bit more into polling or the other outlets where you can get a little bit deeper, don't ultimately have the space or the time to get fully into the weeds on some of this stuff. So it's a venue to be able to do that. The other thing is really to demonstrate that it's not just pollsters who are interested in polling. I mean, there are lots of people who are interested. Our listeners are political junkies, they're political research professionals, they're social scientists, they're elected officials. I mean, they're really all over the place. And so it's been fun really to get folks together who find sort of the breadth of exploring public opinion writ large, kind of a place to come together. I think the third thing is it is still ultimately, at least for me, politics, like gearing up for 2016, kind of thinking about, tracking the political landscape and the polling landscape from the almost the very beginning.
One of the other things that we really wanted to focus on early on is making sure that we were sort of marketing our show widely. That we can sit in a booth every week and record an hour of us talking about polls that we find interesting. And even if nobody listened, I think it would still be a really good thing that we're doing because it keeps me informed about the different polls in my industry that are coming out on topics that I might not always follow. It's just a good discipline for me, and I think for Margie as well. Given that we do the TV punditry thing, this is sort of like forces us to stay in shape and always know what's going on in terms of polls, not just the polls of the moment about 2016 and politics, but the broader environment of what's going on in media and tech and pop culture. But I think we also wanted to make sure that if we were going to do this, that we did have a big audience. And so we focused early on. I mean, Margie went out to go, get a good logo designed for us, because that when people are going through iTunes and trying to choose which podcasts they want to listen to, you want an image that's going to be a good image. And, we tried to nail down getting the Twitter handle and what have you. And the process of trying to find a name for the podcast, we went back and forth a couple of rounds on what we would call it, and just settled on the Pollsters, because we wanted something that was simple and that would let people know exactly what they were getting if they were tuning into our show.
Yes, that was Kristen's. We had quite a few folks who have gone deep in the archives for whatever reason would see that we struggled a lot with our name, that we tried quite a few different names, and we released everything. I mean, we had pilots, and we released everything that we did, all sort of our practice runs, which, obviously we've improved as we've honed our format, but I think the early ones still stand up, but we did have different names in the beginning, and ultimately, after a few rounds, Kristen's like, well, how about the Pollsters? Oh my God, amazingly, nobody's taken that anywhere. I don't know how that's happened. So we were very lucky to snag that.
Well, what's interesting to me is that you, Margie, if this was originally your brainchild, so to speak, you could have decided to start a polling-based podcast in any number of ways, right? Especially because you mentioned, your background leans more towards the Democratic side. You could have created a Democratic political pollster podcast. You could have easily done that, but you didn't, and you sought sort of the more bipartisan view. You sought more than just political, because and folks listening, there are a lot of other topics covered, and just in the last third of the run so far that I've been tuned into every week, everything from Tom Brady to Miss America to gender issues to workplace stuff. I mean, Canadian, you guys are into Canadian politics now. I guess you guys are hearing a lot about that. So what was the decision like in terms of, I know you said wide audience, but you guys have really gone wide, right?
Well, lots of people have opinions. There are lots of people out with political opinions that have political shows or blogs or who talk about politics. And obviously, opinions are great. What makes our show a little different is having relying on the data and the polls to back it up. And I think, I didn't really have an interest in having a show where I'm just, spouting off my own personal political opinions. I mean, my personal political opinions are, probably, I think farther to the left than the average American voter, and that's okay. My job is not to have my own opinion. My job is to interpret voters' opinions for my clients and to interpret what my clients want to say into a language that voters understand and can relate to and find accessible. So it's not really about my own opinion. So to me, it was very consistent with what I see as my job. And so it made a lot of sense to be bipartisan, not just for the sake of having a broader audience, but for, to go back to the central issue of having, what do the data show? I mean, one thing I would also add is that you have a lot of people who are sick of, the sort of fighting kind of format, the sort of screamy format. Maybe that's a hyperbolic way of phrasing it, but that kind of partisan bickering, whether it's the partisan bickering in Washington or it's the partisan bickering on television. So, people have grown tired of that. So this, at least how we see it, is a little bit of a respite from that.
I couldn't agree more. And I was going to mention that, whether it was by design or a happy side effect, it almost is sort of like example setting, in a sense that sort of this is how two people coming from different places with maybe different personal opinions can look at some huge impactful topics and discuss them civilly, not to necessarily determine who's right or wrong, but to have that discourse. And you're right in the sense that it's not something typically you find on TV, and certainly not in Washington, that the two of you are able to sort of present both sides and sort of allow the listener to kind of take in whatever they like.
Yeah, I think our goal is not to, each week resolve, well, what should the U.S. do about ISIS, or what should the U.S. do about income inequality? Our goal is not to necessarily, argue points on those issues. And, I think our goal is more to help people understand what does America think on these issues? And, is there a disconnect between what our leaders are talking about and where people stand? Is there a disconnect between how the media covers issues and where people stand? So I think we can help flesh out debates in that way. But, our goal every week isn't to try to, see who right or left is going to score the most points or who's right or wrong. but rather, where is America heading? Which are the arguments that are resonating with people? And then, separately, because Margie and I are upfront about our opinions, rather than saying, well, we're a nonpartisan show, because Margie and I are upfront about what our biases might be, I actually think that makes it easier for us to kind of be honest brokers of the data, because we can say, there have been times on the show when I've said, okay, I'm putting my Republican hat on here for a second. Here's why I don't totally love the way this question is worded, but at least I'm upfront about where my bias is. And so, voters can discount my opinion for, accordingly as they see fit. But yeah, I think the market's got tons of places where you can hear people either, expound on their point of view or argue with people of the other point of view. I think our goal is to say you can have different points of view and still, be able to take a look at what data is telling us about issues and where America stands. And so there's a way to become informed about national debates that doesn't just have to come through a partisan lens.
And Margie, earlier you mentioned that there is enough data, enough information, enough conversation out there that could potentially fill 2 to 3 shows a week, which would be a great idea, by the way. But in putting together the one that you guys put out generally weekly at this point, tell us a little bit about what this process is like with all this information coming in, how you guys sort of choose the topic matter. What does sort of the production process look like each week?
So we go through, well, first of all, we go through either we find it on Twitter or we know about it, we see it online, the polls that are coming out all the time. And the stuff that we see most handily, most readily is the 2016 horse race, what's going on in the election. I mean, that's sort of the it's usually the first block. There's always something. I don't think we've had a week where there wasn't news. I mean, even when we've tried to say, okay, maybe we shouldn't talk about it first this week, there's still something. Maybe one time we tried to not talk about it first. It's always really the top thing going on. And we post regularly everything that we're seeing on our Facebook and Twitter feed. So even if we don't end up covering in the show, it's there. And anything that we see, even if we haven't really fully digested or processed it or analyzed it, just so people can see just sort of the latest polls wherever they're from. And we have a Google Doc where we put in all the links and we put in the different topics. We put in some charts. So we're looking at the same page rather than kind of shuffling through a mass of papers. The goal is, to really be able to dig a little bit deeper, to go to the original top lines or the original questionnaire that the outlets release, not just the story that's written about them. Because you can find some pretty interesting stuff there. Sometimes they release crosstabs, again, demographic breakouts for some questions. Sometimes they don't, but whatever outlets release is usually more extensive than what you see simply in the headline. So we try to dig a little bit deeper there, and then find the issue-driven stuff. And we're always going to look at Pew or Gallup. They release new studies every week, but there are lots of others that release things on a regular basis. And sometimes now people send us tips. They send us stories. They pitch their idea. They pitch their stories or their bosses. So we've had some folks reach out to us about that. Or we'll have listeners tweet us or send us email saying, hey, we'd like to hear more about Canada, for example. Or some, folks tweeted us about wanting to hear about the Kentucky Senate race or governor's race, which we haven't gotten to. So people will send us ideas for things they want to hear about, which we also look into, and then we read the other polling outlets out there, the other outlets that write about polling, whether it's the New York Times or 538 or Huffington Post. They write about polls on a regular basis, and that's a good resource for examining. And then there'll be something fun, and the fun thing usually ends up, that's in our Facebook feed or in a Google search. I mean, the fun stuff is often a organization trying to time a release around a holiday or some kind of event. They'll put it out on PR Newswire, and so it's not hard for it to find its way to us. And that's those polls are often designed to be interesting, so somebody covers them, and so so why not us? So that's where you find the funny stuff about how much people have spent on Easter eggs or whatever, those kinds of things. So somebody wants that stuff to be covered. And so we end up finding it that way too. Sometimes we have to dig a little bit deeper, but sometimes it's a little bit more readily accessible.
I think that adding those bits at the end, I think the most recent episode at the time of this recording was the horrible travel habits of hotel guests, those type of things.
That was in the Washington Post, so that was pretty easy to find.
and it's interesting to me how you guys have chosen to sort of put this material together. As I mentioned, I find it intriguing that you could have gone a particular way with this show, and I feel that the way you've chosen to go about it is pretty much the optimum version of a show about polling. You guys are representing all angles, not necessarily coming to decisions, allowing listeners to have their own takeaway, covering very serious matters, like you mentioned, the Iran deal, but also talking about, Deflategate. And I think it's great, the spectrum that you guys are covering. And that's really what I want folks to kind of take away from this conversation, is that, if you are not necessarily a political aficionado, maybe just have a passing interest, check this show out, because there's so much more there, and you will learn a lot. I know I have. I wanted to talk a little bit about the feedback that you guys have received. You mentioned suggestions come in. I'm curious, so far at this run, so far of 33 episodes at the time of this recording, what has the feedback been? Is it as fanboyish as I'm coming across in this show, or is it you guys have differing opinions, or have you gotten anybody really angry, or how has that been received so far?
God, I don't think we've gotten anybody angry,
awesome,
as far as I know. What do you think, Kristen?
No, the fact that we haven't gotten anybody angry almost makes me worry that we're not doing something right. It's the internet. How can somebody not be angry?
Right. I mean, it just might mean that they're not quite listening yet. I don't know, but I think I did get an email about something. It wasn't anger. It was like a mild clarification. But I think people have been really really responsive. I mean, we have a network of folks that we told about the show through our own email lists and our own social media channels. It's, been an opportunity for us to get booked together sometimes, which I think is a fun way to talk about the show and talk about polling, and is a good hook for bookers and producers who are like, okay, well, this is, these are pollsters who they have a show. They're the pollsters, and we need to talk to some pollsters. And here are some people who call themselves the pollsters. So it's kind of an easy angle there. Folks who I know who've listened to it have all been really responsive to it, because we got in kind of right at a good moment in podcasting, as I'm sure your listeners know, where there are just tons and tons of new shows, tons and tons of attention to the medium, and lots of political shows, all the Panoply shows that have been coming out. I mean, just a few more in the last 2 weeks. That it's just been a really good moment, I think, for people to pay attention to the medium as a way for every kind of topic to be discussed and explored. And this was one that that there was a need, there was a space.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it anyways, through the lens of the show, from the website, and folks, links to the Pollsters website, as well as their Twitter and Facebook, are in the show notes, as always. But through the website, I was reading the About page for each of you in preparation for our conversation, and both of you've made allusion to it, have had long careers in this industry, and you have had guest spots and are frequently interviewed and talked to on major network broadcasts and in print and so on and so forth. So I don't necessarily mean this in the way of nerves per se, but as this show continues to take off, and I've sort of been tracking it as it goes, looking at things like iTunes review counts, you guys are doing really, really well, and maybe one or two more people might come and listen to you after our conversation on this episode. But more importantly, as we track to the election itself, I can imagine this show just really gaining traction and steam and attention and what have you. Does that apply a certain amount of pressure to sort of assembling these show notes each week and deciding what to talk to, or how you kind of cover each of these topics? Is there any worry about that over, say, the next 13 months?
I think we are hopeful that this show will blow up, because we think that there's going to be so much coverage of the polls, and there's a potential for a lot of that coverage to be good, but there's also a potential for a lot of that coverage to kind of miss the mark or misinterpret what the polls may mean about the election. And so if our voices can be out there kind of setting the record straight or steering the conversation in a productive direction, I think that'll be a huge opportunity for us. So I'm really excited about what the next year can bring, because as Margie said, I think we hit the timing just right on launching a podcast on this topic. I think an important goal for us will be to make sure that we're thoroughly covering 2016 and the horse race without letting our show become too dominated by it, because we still want to make sure that we're hitting on all of this other stuff that is happening in, not just American life, but global life and culture and technology. And, we don't just want this to become an American politics show. We want it to be something that everybody can get on board with. So that may be, it'll be a cool opportunity for us as the election evolves, but also a challenge for us to really keep our focus and not spend, 45 or 50 minutes of our hour-long show just talking about the election.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't want to speak for Kristen. I mean, I don't get nervous. I mean, I think, as long as we stick to the data and we have an idea of what topics we're going to discuss, I don't feel the pressure of sort of thinking about, what will this mean when the election has a different field, different kinds of candidates rise to the top, 6 months from now. I think we're calling it kind of how we see it at the moment. And I think another piece of what we may want to do going forward is how do we structure the show in a way that it's even more, I don't want to say formal, but more structured in a way that reflects all the different components that we want to cover. Do we want to have, a 2016 piece, a kind of issues piece, something international, something methodological, and then something fun in every show? That's something we could play around with. How much more structured do we want to be? Because there's always so much material. The question is, how do we weave it together in a way without getting too long?
Absolutely. And it's super interesting to me because talking about timing, and I'm going to ask for a little bit of personal opinion, not necessarily a partisan commentary, just sort of broad general comments here. I'm a youngish guy, mid to late 30s, let's say youngish. And I don't think that I've been through in my adult life, or even that I can remember as a child, what is shaping up to be a more interesting, more unique, more newsworthy presidential election than what we've got on our doorstep now, be it from quote unquote non-politicians making such a statement at this point, or the first real legitimate women candidate that has a real shot, so to speak, in terms of odds. Let's say news is going to be made one way or another in the next 13 months. Is it just me, or is this totally unique in our history at this point?
You've also got the whole spectacle of a front-running presidential candidate who is kind of obsessed with talking about polls. So Donald Trump,
Right.
Every single day there's some new comment where he's talking about where he stands in the polls or what the polls mean, or he's tweeting out some kind of a poll.
He doesn't need he doesn't need pollsters. That's his other favorite.
I think every campaign stop is opened with, we're going to go celebrate the results of this poll.
It has created a very unique I think, news environment for us pollsters who we love talking about this stuff, but we're not used to candidates being their own, loudest pundits on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, and then, then another thing to say, or another thing is like, the polls, don't spend so much time thinking about the polls now. They take it from a pollster, look at what the candidates are saying, look at the other things going on in the atmospherics, what's going on in their campaigns, how much money are they raising, what kind of staffer do they have, what kind of operation do they have on the ground. There's a lot to it at this stage besides just what the polls show. And if pollsters are telling you that, then maybe people need to, start thinking about that, as opposed to kind of following every twist and turn in the polls. As to whether this campaign is unique, I mean, I think you have people increasingly becoming incredibly disillusioned with our political system and with our government. And you see that in the climate on both sides, on the Democratic side and the Republican side. People just feel like Washington is broken. They've been saying that for a long time. I haven't been in a focus group, but people say, everybody's doing a great job there in Washington. Congress is just, they're, give them a high five. I mean, people have always been down on Washington, but it just has gotten so much worse to a point where, you don't know what could turn it around at this point. There doesn't seem to be a candidate or a climate that could turn it around at this point, and then that's a shame. And I find that sad to measure and sad to watch and sad to hear in focus groups when people talk about how they feel about their representatives and their leadership and the major institutions in the country. And I think that's something that is going to be part of this climate. I think that's why you see outsider seeming candidates do well, is because of that frustration. What ends up happening in terms of who wins the nomination, that's, we can't say that really.
Right.
We don't know right now, but you do see this attraction to outsiders as a response to that.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be interesting, and I'm one of those that as the date gets near, I become more and more interested. But really, I'm probably more extremely interested than others. I've watched, I think, just about every minute of every debate so far, and it's so early at this point, but I still find it wild. And I watch them both, not necessarily divulging my political alliances per se. I don't know that I even have one. I sort of get a little bit from this side and a little bit from that side, but I've watched every minute, and it is already compelling to read and listen to shows like you guys have with the pollsters, or watch the debates and the news coverage. And personally, I think this is something that's going to be amazing to watch moving forward as compared to years past. I mean, I think obviously 2004 and 2008 with President Obama, that was amazing in and of itself, historic in and of itself for all the obvious reasons. But I'm almost thinking this time around is going to be even bigger in the sense of, look what the U.S. is doing with their presidential elections now,
Yeah.
And I'll be anxious to hear you folks take on it as we go through this process, because in what the polling comes back and what your input is on that as well. So what is the future like for the pollsters? Some obvious stuff. You talked a little bit about the format and the structure, obviously covering the presidential process. But what else could folks hitting the subscribe button right now look to see in the next years to come?
Years to come. Yeah, plural. I mean,
there's polls after we have a new president. Then you'll have to poll about how they're being received first 30 days, first year.
Of course. Yeah. No, well, there's always polls to cover. I think people can expect to see presidential horse race polling, but also perhaps key races for Senate as those heat up, or any races for the House that may get interesting as we get closer to the election. You'll see more of those kinds of polls get released, but as well as tracking what's going on just in the national public attitude toward everything, top issues, whether it's immigration or guns or the economy or taxes or social issues, gay marriage, you name it, those kinds of things. There's constantly polls on that we want to cover, as well as the international elections and trends and methodology that people say that are important to the industry, that our listeners who are part of the industry like to hear about, and folks who like to follow this closely like to hear about. But also, if people have things that they want us to cover, they should let us know. If they have a poll that their organization is releasing, they can send it our way and we'll take a look. We haven't spent as much time, I think, as maybe we'd like to talk about what corporations are doing, different reputational trackers, how companies use research to track what's going on in their worlds. I mean, that's another area. So there's just tons and tons to talk about. So if people have ideas, if they have things that they are seeing out there that they want us to take a look at, they should feel free to send it along anytime.
I also think one of the things you're going to see us talk about a lot over the coming years are the continuing changes in how we conduct polls. More methodology stories as new ways of conducting research are put into practice and experimented with. We know that calling people up on the landline telephone is becoming less and less and less valuable as a research tool. So there's all kinds of new stuff that's being tried out there, and we expect over the next few years to talk about a lot of that stuff on our show.
Well, anyone who has found an interest in what this show has to offer, who would like to tell them about the website, the Twitter account, so on and so forth?
Oh, I'll take this one since this is my job at the end of every episode.
There you go.
You can find us at the Pollsters on Twitter, and Margie and I separately are at Margie Omero and at Soltis Anderson. We have thepollsters.com. You can also find us on Facebook, where you'll find us posting the polls and such that we find interesting as the week goes on.
And I should also note, we haven't covered it, but Kristen recently released a book called The Selfie Vote, and it is fantastic, and folks should check that out. It's about the role of millennials, how to study millennials, what Republicans can learn from millennials, and it's at theselfievote.com.
Thank you, Margie. I appreciate it.
Hey, anytime.
And I'm glad you brought that up as well, because I did see that in the about. But to be honest with you, you both of you ladies have done so much. I was wondering which one to talk about. You guys have impressive resumes, and it is as I mentioned from the outset, very humbling that both of you had the chance and were willing to take the time to come and talk about the Pollsters with me. And I thank you very much for the time.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having us.
Of course. Thank you.
Well, folks, that will do it for this week's episode of the Podcast Digest. All the links that both Margie and Kristen had mentioned will be in the show notes. Please check out the Pollsters. I've been enjoying the show for a couple of months now, and I give you my word you will do the same. Folks, until next week, thanks for listening. This is Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.